great to have you part of our new series. Just to give you a bit of an overview of what the series is. So, with it being the Year of Skills, we've partnered with Hydrogen Europe and the SEC, and we're working with key actors across the sector, across hydrogen and climate tech, to really sort of dive into people's careers and look at people on the front line and how they're essentially combating climate change. So, to kick us off, I think it'd be great to understand, firstly, a bit more about your background and how you've ended up sat here chatting to me today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, George, and I'm honoured to get a slot in the diary. Yeah, I'm an automotive guy, really. I've lived and worked around the world, well, mostly in Asia, in South Korea, in Japan, and actually I spent sort of almost 10 years working in Germany as well. And a lot of people call me quite Teutonic as a result. But I started my life in automotive, working for BMW, running Hyundai Motor Europe, and then working for a guy called Carlos Ghosn in Japan as head of global sales for Nissan before I came back to the UK. And since I came back to the UK, I've been working for a series of small businesses, private equity and startups. And I'm currently with First Hydrogen, who I've been with almost 2 years. And we're all about bringing our hydrogen fuel cell vans to market right now.
Perfect. And then, obviously, you mentioned you've worked in the automotive sector for a while and you've moved more into the sustainability side. What has sort of drove that decision and drove that change, would you say?
Well, I'm a sort of I'm the chief commercial officer in our small organisation, and what I love about the role I've got is the leadership bit, really, of our internal and external extended organisations. And I'll be honest with you, there's been a transition in the sector. You see this even across the major OEMs, a massive fragmentation in the market that's meant that a lot of the innovation that's tasked with achieving zero emission goals has moved into smaller organisations and startups across Europe and the world, really. And so I've been caught in that transition.
Yeah.
And what I enjoy, if you bring the two together, is actually working across the generations of managers and people in organisations who've got very different expectations, very different communication needs, and actually bringing my experience to that environment, which certainly in hydrogen at the moment, it's very nascent, it's very immature, is very much about networking and planning. And with my deal making and commercial skills, I think there's an interesting cocktail there, as long as one's sensitive to those expectations and communication needs across generations of people in the business.
Yeah, definitely. And then that rolls into the next question, really. Obviously, you've worked for pretty much every major automotive business globally, from Jaguar to BMW, as you mentioned, and then now with First Hydrogen. Not just at First Hydrogen in terms of sustainability, but across the entire career. What would you say the major challenges that you faced, and how have you navigated the sort of automotive and now the sustainability sector?
Well, I think for me, the soft and hard skills, as I just mentioned, and bringing my sort of hard deal-making skills to the softer environment of planning policy is what I enjoy about the environment I'm in at the moment. What drives me personally, being a commercial guy, what drives me personally is, and what I've become increasingly engaged with, is inequality and how to bring equality of opportunity to whatever I'm doing in business. That's what really drives me, and managing the incompatibility and frictions in business, of which there are tons. I mean, we were just saying ahead of this call that every business has its issues at the moment. Otherwise, people like myself wouldn't be in a job. But what I'm all about is managing those frictions and trying to reach agreement, because despite the fact that some people will say that actually I can be quite combative and quite contentious in my approach, which I can, actually I hate sort of conflict. I hate it. And actually I'll do anything to manage an amicable outcome, which actually if I'm honest with myself, is quite a useful skill in a disrupted and uncertain world, really.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
it does, because I agree, because I think I'm exactly the same. So in the same circumstances, sometimes I don't think conflict always alludes to the best answer, right? It's more about what's happened, how can we solve it, and how can we put a plan in place to deal with what's happened. Sometimes bad things have happened and they need fixing, so being annoyed about the situation is never going to help, right? So no, I completely agree with you on that point, most definitely. Going back to the career as well, what would you say the biggest achievements you've made so far in terms of fighting climate change? I know there is some stuff that's confidential, but what would you say maybe the one or two biggest achievements you've made so far?
I've had responsibility at Hyundai for the European deployment of hydrogen fuel cell, and clearly Hyundai have a tremendous track record in that area. I was driving iX35 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles 10 years ago.
Yeah,
And at Nissan, an interesting time. I actually had global responsibility for the Nissan Leaf sales and success,
yeah,
and arguably that's one I missed dramatically, because whilst Nissan was first to market with electric vehicles, it certainly hasn't benefited from the upsurge in BEV technology. But I think really my achievements have been around team building
yeah,
and okay, commercial outcomes are important, but if you talk to the teams in Mark Group, the private equity owned
yeah,
software house I came from before we sold the business
yeah,
in the UK, at Lookers, where I was for a short time when I landed back from Japan, at Hyundai Motor Europe and the 26 different markets, and at Nissan, where I was responsible for sales and performance across the world, I still got strong networks across all those businesses. And I think I can point to individuals and teams that have benefited from my help and support.
yeah.
And quite apart from the hard outcomes, I think when I really reflect, that's my contribution to net zero outcomes in the next 10 to 15 years. I hope
Yeah.
that there are generations of leadership that are going to come to market with some of the benefits and experience of having worked with me.
Oh, no, that's I really appreciate the insight on that. I think it's a nice way to look at it. It'd be great to look back and think, oh, we did X deal, we did Y deal, but seeing the next generation of people come through that are going to be pushing the industry forward, I think is definitely a great way to look at it. And that moves into the next question that I have is, I'm going to take you back a little bit in terms of the first day that you had at BMW and the early stages of your career. If you could think retrospectively, what key pieces of advice would you give to people that are sort of kicking off their career in sustainability or renewable energy?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this one clearly. I saw this one coming, and you gave me a heads up. And I guess what I'm trying to say in this discussion is that for me, sustainability and net zero and climate change, it has to be. It's a fundamental outcome of what's gone before, and my role is keeping us on course to get to those targets. I think the most important pieces of advice would be do what gives you satisfaction. I mean, it started with me talking to my sons about doing what makes you happy. But there's a
Yeah,
difference between satisfaction and happy. And I used to do a lot of athletics, and I used to go out to the track and run 400, 800 meter repeats. Now,
yeah,
that's the most painful thing you're likely to do, and it doesn't give you any happiness at all. But when you're finished, there's an amazing satisfaction about that, which is I liken to some of the hard-won achievements that one has in business. So that's the first thing. Know what satisfaction, the difference between satisfaction and happiness is, and
yeah,
try and strive for them. And you can see I've made some notes here. I've tried to, and everybody will talk about resilience at the moment. It's a very popular word, but I
yeah,
think just be determined. What I've learned as I've got older is sometimes you've just got to stick at it, particularly in an uncertain world when you don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. I think the final thing, there's always three, aren't there, is understand your place in the world. I mean, I either, and a way of doing that is to connect with great people, understand what good looks like, and surround yourself with good and positive people. There's definitely a premium for optimism these days. But importantly for me, it's meant working internationally. As I said, I've worked in Germany 3 times. I've worked in South Korea, Japan. I've worked in China. I've worked in the Middle East when it was just sand. And I think there's nothing quite like looking back into your own culture and country from another place. And I don't mean just visiting there. People that tell you they've worked in China because they've been 15 times, forget it. You need to live in those countries and really understand how it feels to be a long way from home and to work in a different culture. But most importantly, to understand how you're being heard. The great thing about speaking a foreign language is not necessarily being able to communicate with other people outbound, but to really comprehend how other people are listening and hearing to you. And that whole perspective shift, I think, is the third thing I'd encourage people to do. Go and live in other places, find your place in the world, both physically and socially and commercially.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, and I think that's a really key message. What you said finally, in terms of think about the message that people are receiving. It's not always what you think is coming out of the mouth, right? But the message that is received on the other end is super, super key. And I think that leads into the last question that I have, in terms of, we're working really hard in terms of how there's so many projects and so many businesses building at the moment that we need to look left and right into other industries to grow our sector naturally. If you were in oil and gas, or you were in a different petrochemical industry or nuclear, what advice would you give to people transitioning into sort of hydrogen, clean tech, FCEV? What would your thoughts on that
be? Some stuff I've learned recently, I can be quite empathetic and emotional rather than analytical. I can do the analytical stuff. As you get older, you tend to trust your instincts more. I still do, but what I learned, particularly when I moved out of my comfort zone into data and research in my private equity days before I came to First Hydrogen, was always ask for the data. Always ask for the data, and that's key. But once you've got the data, the most important thing, no matter where you are, one of my previous bosses, who will remain nameless, used to say to me, Mr. Rushforth, just remember, 95% of any great strategy is execution. So that the most important thing to do is, when you've got the data and you've thought about it, you've got to make something happen. You've got to make something happen, because there's tons of analysis, there's tons of networking, there's a premium on connections these days, but actually what the whole sector needs in terms of renewables, whether that's gases, petroleum, battery electric vehicles, or hydrogen, we need execution. Right now, we've got to make stuff happen, because once when you can look over your shoulder and see where you've been, it's a lot easier to see where you're going. But if you've got nothing behind you, it's a lot tougher to make that first step.
Perfect. Really appreciate the insight on that as well. And as I said, it's an absolute pleasure to have you all, Allan, and to get your insight. If it helps one person, right, then we're doing the right thing. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you take part.
For sure, thanks, George. It's been a pleasure for me too. And if I can help you or any of the people that tune in, click in, or listen to this this interview, then happy to do it.